The man known to history as Richard the Lionheart was born on the 8th of September 1157 in England, possibly at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, one of the royal residences of the Angevin royal family during the 12th century. His father was King Henry II of England, who was born in 1133. Henry had taken possession of the French territories of the successors of William the Conqueror in the 1140s, including the Duchy of Normandy and the County of Maine in the north of France, but he had contested for years with his cousin, King Stephen I, for possession of England and Wales. Then, 3 years prior to Richard's birth, he finally ascended to these territories when Stephen died, bringing the extended civil war to an end. Richard's mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a formidable woman herself who had earlier been married to King Louis VII of France before divorcing him and marrying Henry in 1154. As the successor to the Duchy of Aquitaine in western France, she had brought this territory to the marriage, expanding the territory ruled by Henry to cover much of northern and western France, in addition to England and Wales. And the dynasty which Richard was born into is known to posterity as the Plantagenets, after a flower of the order of Plantagenista, which Henry II's father used to wear. This family now ruled extended territories on either side of the English Channel, and Richard's life would be spent straddling these two worlds, where the Plantagenets were the royal family of England, as well as a major noble family in France. Richard's early life was typical of a family which ruled over a very disparate dominion. King Henry II was the King of England and Lord of Wales, much as the modern-day state of England has included a close connection with Wales for centuries, but the Plantagenet dominions stretched much further still. As the descendant of William the Conqueror, Henry ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in northern France, along with several other territories in northern and western France, such as the County of Maine. Moreover, as we have seen, his marriage to Eleanor had brought the Duchy of Aquitaine into the Plantagenet sphere of control. As a consequence, Henry's dominions were nearly as extensive as those of the French monarchy in France, with the south and east of the country ruled by the French kings from Paris. However, owing to the peculiarities of France's territorial divisions, the kings of England swore allegiance to the French kings as subjects, as dukes of Normandy, even while simultaneously challenging the French crown for political and military predominance throughout France. As well as this, Henry II oversaw the establishment of a new English lordship across the Irish Sea during Richard's youth. Thus, what is known as the Angevin Empire stretched across England, Wales, Ireland, and most of northern and central France. It was this disparate territory which Richard would one day come to rule over. During his youth, many would not have countenanced the idea that young Richard would one day succeed to the kingship, as he had an older brother named Henry after the king himself, while he also had 2 younger brothers, Geoffrey and John, and 3 sisters, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, each of whom would play a consequential part in Richard's life at one time or another. As was typical for the age, the upbringing of Richard and his siblings was the responsibility of his mother. Much of it was entrusted to a nurse named Hodierna, to whom Richard later granted a substantial pension in recognition of her service. As is typical of the time, little concrete evidence is available for Richard's youth and education, but we know that he would have received a conventional education for a royal son, insofar as it focused on the art of war. Yet, he was able to read and speak Latin to a very high level, while he also evidently had a keen interest in poems and music. Moreover, several Muslim writers would later attest to him having an interest in Arab culture, although it is unclear if this evinces some previous learning on his part or was cited by Muslim authors as a way of suggesting the English king was possessed of a considerable cultural tolerance.
This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, the amazing documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers that includes subjects such as ancient and modern history, science, the earth and nature, true crime, as well as historical drama. We love the series The Warrior's Way, the original superheroes, and especially the episode Knights to Templars, Geoffroy de Champagne. The superb documentary covers the Knights Templars, God's warriors forged out of the Crusades. Knight Geoffroy de Champagne foregoes earthly pleasures to join the Templars and proudly wears the white mantle with a red cross. The Knights Templars' greatest patron was Richard the Lionheart, England's great Crusader King. With Magellan TV, there are no advertisements and you can watch content anytime, anywhere, on your TV, laptop or mobile phone. And with 15 to 20 hours of new content being added on a weekly basis, you will always have something to watch. And with an annual membership costing only $59.88, you pay only $4.99 per month for over 3,500 hours of viewing time. Viewers can take advantage of a special holiday offer. Buy one, get one free gift card for an annual membership by clicking on the link in the description.
Richard's adult life was overwhelmingly connected with France rather than England, and this association began early. In June 1172, he was formally made the Duke of Aquitaine when he was just 14 years old. A year later, he was implicated in the first of a series of internal wars within the Plantagenet family as Eleanor and her sons allied with King Louis VII of France against their father. During this rebellion, Richard was actually knighted by King Louis, and in the summer of 1173 he saw his first significant military action in Normandy. Just weeks later, his father offered Richard full possession of several major castles in France and half of the revenues of Aquitaine, to which he had ascended largely just in name the previous year. This was initially rejected by Richard, however. The nature of the rebellion changed in November 1173 when Eleanor was captured by Henry II. The fighting continued for months thereafter until Henry the Younger and King Louis elected to make peace with King Henry in 1174. And Richard, who was already showing a surprising degree of independence for a teenager, finally submitted himself in September 1174. Terms were given to the sons, but Eleanor would effectively remain her husband's prisoner for years to come, as a means of offsetting further unrest within the family. Henry II was evidently impressed by his second eldest son's performance during the war. This was a time when familial rivalry, which spilled over into actual rebellion, was not entirely uncommon, and the king would not have viewed his son's revolt as marking a fatal break with them. Accordingly, in the aftermath of the revolt, Henry gave Richard full control of some of the armed forces of the Duchy of Aquitaine, with orders to reduce any rebels who emerged there to peace. This was the first experience of genuine power and rule which Richard would enjoy from 1175 onwards through to the late 1180s. Much of this work focused on quelling any independent streaks among the nobility of western and central France, notably Aymar, the Viscount of Limoges, and Guillaume, the Count of Angoulême, both of whom were inclined to challenge Plantagenet primacy in the region. In 1176 and 1177, this military campaigning even extended as far south as the borders of Navarre, a small Basque kingdom straddling the Pyrenees in both France and Spain. Consequently, Richard began to develop his reputation for military prowess at a very young age, as he was still shy of his 20th birthday at this time when he undertook these campaigns. It was this military ability which later earned him the name of Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, a name which was entering into widespread use by the mid to late 1180s. We know a lot about the character of the individual who was emerging at this time from several chronicles composed on him by contemporary or near-contemporary historians and writers such as Ralph of Coggeshall and Benedict of Peterborough. Richard was evidently exceptionally tall by the standards of the 12th century, standing well over 6 foot high. He was handsome, with reddish blonde hair and a pale complexion. He was known to have a character which favoured military prowess, and he cultivated an image of himself as a great warrior, one who patronised troubadours and poets, though somebody who was also prone to pride and greed and was sometimes quick to anger. He married later in his life, after lengthy negotiations, to have him wedded to Berengaria, the eldest daughter of Sancho VI of Navarre, although the union would never produce any children. This latter lack of children, combined with some contemporary allusions to Richard's sexuality, have led 20th century historians to query whether Richard was in fact gay and did not produce any children with Berengaria for this reason. But this is still open to debate, with the sources proving ambiguous, leading other historians to conclude that he might have actually been bisexual. The late 1170s and early 1180s saw Richard's relationship with his father strengthening, despite the rebellion years earlier. In 1176 and 1177, he campaigned as far away as northern Spain in order to shore up the Angevin Empire's southern boundaries in Aquitaine. Simultaneously, his actions could often prove overly heavy-handed, and there are many instances of his crushing of local rebellions, and in particular the pulling down of castles of those whose loyalties were suspected, leading to resentment and unrest. As one poet of the period, Bertrand de Born, noted, "He besieges and pursues them, takes their castles, and smashes and burns in every direction." Even by the standards of an age which expected warlike behaviour of its rulers, there is the inference here that young Richard the Lionheart's tactics were excessive. Resentment at this brutal suppression of any signs of revolt culminated most notably in the outbreak of a major rebellion within Gascony in southwestern France in the late 1170s and early 1180s, and in the Limousin region towards central France. Richard continued to suppress these instances of unrest, though the degree to which he was responsible for causing them through his own heavy-handed rule over Aquitaine is debatable, given the manner in which his actions were often depicted in an overly positive light by later chroniclers. Underlying all of this activity in the late 1170s and into the early 1180s was continuing familial conflict amongst Richard, his brothers and their father, aggravated by Henry II's ongoing imprisonment of their mother Eleanor, and much of this increasingly focused on the issue of the succession, as Henry II neared his 50th year, which would have been considered the beginnings of old age in the 12th century. Whilst Henry was his eldest son and heir designate according to the principle of primogeniture, the disparate nature of the Angevin Empire and the antagonistic relationship between Henry and his sons ensured that there was much confusion as to who would succeed to which parts of Henry's dominions and perennial tensions as a result. Richard, for instance, clearly hoped to secure Aquitaine for himself over his elder brother. This all boiled over in the winter of 1182, when King Henry asked Richard to pay homage to his elder brother Henry. This required Richard to acknowledge that Henry would have some say over the Duchy of Aquitaine in time to come, whereas Richard was clearly pressing to have the duchy separated from the wider Angevin Empire and made his own fiefdom upon his father's death. When this became clear, Henry sent the third eldest son, Geoffrey, to Richard's territories to prepare a family confidence. However, this backfired, and instead, Geoffrey entered into a new rebellion with Henry the Younger. 1183 witnessed a dramatic shift in the diplomatic arrangements within the Angevin Empire. On the 11th of June that summer, Henry II's eldest surviving son and namesake, sometimes referred to as Henry the Young King, died of dysentery while yet again in rebellion against his father in central France. Richard was now his father's eldest surviving son and the new heir of the Angevin territories in England, Wales, Ireland, and much of France. On the surface, the reduced number of sons should have made the family rivalries more stable, particularly so when the king's third, Geoffrey, also died in 1186 in largely unclear circumstances surrounding a jousting tournament. Yet this did not bring an end to the Plantagenet family squabbles, and in the years that followed, the king began to increasingly favour his younger son, John, particularly so following Geoffrey's death. Henry now wished for John to inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine, while Richard would take the rest of his father's lands. Conversely, Richard would not easily agree to his father's wishes in this respect, not least because his long-standing ties to Aquitaine had created a personal attachment to the duchy for him. It was thus in an effort to force his father's hand in this respect that Richard allied with the French king Philip II in 1187. It would be the last rebellion between Henry and one of his sons. The rebellion of 1187 proceeded quickly. Philip II had succeeded to the throne of France in 1180 when he was just 15 years of age. He and Richard would have a long-standing rivalry for over a decade between when they first allied with each other and Richard's own death over a decade later. Yet during the late 1180s, it was a highly amicable relationship. A combined military campaign by Richard and Philip against Henry II in early 1189 culminated in a major military defeat of Henry in the summer of 1189. At a final conference, Henry was visibly ill and is believed to have cursed Richard. He died days later on the 6th of July 1189, leaving Richard as his clear successor. And the new king moved quickly to secure his patrimony. He was invested as the Duke of Normandy 2 weeks later on the 20th of July. Later that summer, he made one of the few very brief visits he ever made to England and was crowned as king there on the 3rd of September 1189. Finally, after over 15 years of internal strife, the political landscape of the Angevin Empire seemed to be settling down. Richard had only his brother John as a rival. He might have posed little threat, but now, just at the moment of his final victory, Richard was preparing to head to a new challenge, one very far away. A call had come from the Crusader states of the Holy Land. The Crusades were an ongoing series of wars which European Christians had been engaged in since the late 11th century to reclaim the Holy Land around Palestine and Syria, especially Jerusalem, for the Christian powers. For centuries after the rise of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Holy Land had remained in Christian hands, specifically as part of the Byzantine Empire. However, in the 7th century, these territories were quickly overrun and conquered by the Arabs and assimilated into their caliphate, which was soon ruled from Baghdad. Yet, while the loss of the holy places associated with Jesus and his followers was a blow for Christian Europe, it was mitigated by the general tolerance of the Muslim powers, which allowed Christian pilgrims from Europe to visit the Holy Land relatively unimpeded. But in the course of the 11th century, this equilibrium changed as the Seljuk Turks, an aggressively expansionist people from Central Asia, conquered most of the Middle East, threatening the Byzantine Empire's capital at Constantinople and reducing access for Christians to the Holy Land. In response, the Byzantine imperial government appealed to the Christian powers of Western Europe to come to their aid against the Turks. The resulting response led to 2 centuries of crusading activity between the 1090s and the 1290s. In 1095, Pope Urban II first preached the need for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. This met with a highly enthusiastic response, and tens of thousands took the Crusader cross and headed eastwards, including numerous senior nobles from France, England, and Germany. and by 1099 this First Crusade had resulted in the conquest of the Holy Land and the establishment of several Crusader states, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. These kingdoms and principalities flourished for decades, until a Muslim force reconquered the city of Edessa in 1144, triggering a second crusade between 1147 and 1150. Although King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany went east on this occasion, the Second Crusade met with little success, and things were calm again for years afterwards. But in the 1170s and early 1180s, a new Muslim ruler from Kurdistan succeeded in uniting the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, thus encircling the Crusader kingdoms. This warlord's name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is more widely known by his honorific title Saladin, meaning the goodness of faith. In the summer of 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin, and that autumn Jerusalem was recaptured from the Christians. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem. Richard had already determined to head to the Holy Land on crusade as early as 1187, as news of Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin had trickled into Europe. And in the months that followed, King Philip of France, and indeed King Henry II, prior to his death, had committed to doing the same. These were not untypical acts for leading European monarchs and lords who wished to appear committed to the crusading ideal, but in this particular instance, the Western European monarchs were wholly committed to doing so, and Richard remained committed to undertaking his quest to the Middle East following his accession as king. And so plans were underway to depart throughout the summer and autumn of 1189 and into the winter. The primary goal here was to raise sufficient financing for the initiative, one which would require a considerable fleet to convey troops across the Mediterranean, as well as massive logistical support over several years. A tithe, or 10% tax, was raised to that end to fund the crusade, known as the Saladin tithe, one which had been begun by Henry II before his death. Simultaneously, the church hierarchy of England and of the various Angevin territories in Wales, Ireland and France were coerced into providing thousands of pounds of funding towards the Third Crusade, which Richard was now committed to undertaking in 1190. There were some final preparations to be made in England and France before Richard could depart. The goal here was to put in place individuals in the regions, particularly the various duchies and counties under his control in France, who would prop up Richard's rule during what was sure to be a lengthy absence in the Holy Land. Thus, William Fitzralph, a stalwart of Henry II's rule and one who had shown considerable support for Richard since his accession, was confirmed as Seneschal of the Duchy of Normandy, effectively making him the governor of the large territory of northern France. Payne de Rochefort was appointed as his counterpart as Seneschal of Anjou in western France, but most significant was the appointment of William de Longchamp, the Lord Chancellor of England, as the head of the government there during Richard's absence. It was a cutting rebuke of Richard's brother John, who might have hoped to be given a greater role in the governance of his brother's dominions during his absence. And his dissatisfaction at this development would lead to several years of unrest while Richard was away, during which John would seek to continually undermine his brother, principally by attempting to usurp his position as king in England, Normandy, and elsewhere. After months of preparations, the crusade was finally ready to depart by the summer of 1190. At this early stage, it would be effectively co-led by Richard and the French king Philip II. And the two kings left Vézelay in central France together on the 4th of July 1190. They separated at Lyon, where Philip led his contingents by land over the Alps through Italy, while Richard elected to make for Marseille to sail along the Italian coastline to Sicily from the southern French port. There were extensive delays during these passages, as much of the fleet, which had been sent from England and western France around the Iberian Peninsula, had been delayed in entering the Mediterranean Sea. Notably, a drunken spree by the soldiers while in Lisbon in Portugal had particularly slowed the proceedings, and so Richard had to hire other ships at Marseille to send much of his forces to the Holy Land ahead of him. And he then conducted a lengthy tour of the Italian coastline to visit locations in the region such as the medical school of Salerno, a trip which evinced Richard's interest in the new learning of the 12th century Renaissance which was underway in Italy. Finally, he arrived in Messina in Sicily on the 23rd of September 1190. Here, Richard conferred with Philip before the French monarch quickly headed away to the Holy Land. Richard, however, had matters to attend to in Sicily before leaving himself. In 1177, Richard's sister Joan had married King William II of Sicily, known as William the Good. William died in November 1189, and the crown was quickly usurped by an illegitimate contender named Tancred. This Tancred then imprisoned Joan, fearing she would become a focus of resistance to his reign. Having arrived in Sicily, Richard quickly secured her release, but there were serious issues still to be resolved concerning Joan's dowry and valuable household plate. Tensions quickly escalated in late September and early October, and by the 2nd of October, Richard had ordered his troops to disembark fully from their ships and prepare for battle if necessary. When skirmishes broke out between Richard and Tancred's troops 2 days later, Richard ordered an attack on the city of Messina, one which quickly proved successful. Peace terms were agreed on the 6th of October, whereby Tancred paid a huge sum of money to Richard, and a formal alliance was agreed between the two. Simultaneously, ships were sent to Spain to bring Richard's long-promised bride, Berengaria of Navarre, to Sicily, so that the pair could have their long-awaited marriage during the winter of 1190 as they waited to set off for the Holy Land. However, it would not happen here. When Richard finally left his base at Messina, it was several days more before Berengaria finally arrived to Sicily. Richard's Crusader army finally left Italy on the 10th of April 1191, consisting in total of over 200 ships and 17,000 soldiers and mariners. It soon ran into difficulties, but in the long run these would prove highly fortuitous. On the 3rd day out from Sicily, a severe storm scattered the fleet, and by the time the ships rendezvoused near the large Greek island of Crete, it was clear that dozens of ships had either been lost or had gone astray in their navigations. And these included one of the royal ships transporting Richard's would-be bride Berengaria and his sister Joan. This particular ship could not simply be abandoned, and a wide-ranging search throughout the eastern Mediterranean was now undertaken to locate it. Eventually, it was discovered to be at anchor in the port of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had long been a possession of the Eastern Byzantine Empire and was governed by Isaac Doukas Komnenos. Komnenos had recently developed delusions of grandeur and had proclaimed himself Emperor of Cyprus independently of Constantinople. Now, in the summer of 1191, he seized several of the scattered Crusader ships and was considering doing the same with the ship on which Joan and Berengaria were travelling. It would prove a fateful mistake. In early May, Richard arrived in Cyprus. When the self-proclaimed Emperor Komnenos refused to release the captured ships and prisoners, Richard decided on immediate military intervention and attacked the city of Limassol. A surprise night attack quickly saw the capital completely overrun. Although the emperor managed to escape, this effectively robbed him of his treasury and military support. And in the weeks that followed, further resistance was mopped up and Cyprus was brought under the control of the Crusaders. Much of this was achieved by Richard linking up with the leaders of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. One of their primary leaders, Guy de Lusignan, having received word of events in Cyprus, arrived with several contingents of hardened Crusader warriors. De Lusignan was the titular king of Jerusalem, albeit he was a king without a city since the fall of the Holy City to Saladin several years earlier, and he was challenged amongst the nobles of the Crusader states for primacy, notably by Conrad de Montferrat, a claimant to the kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy and Conrad would prove to be the most significant figures, other than Richard and Saladin, in the events which followed in the Holy Land. By the beginning of June, Richard had seized control over the entirety of Cyprus, a rich island nation with notable trade links, and one which would serve as a crucial base for the Crusaders in years to come. In the broader term, Cyprus became an independent Christian kingdom, one which was ruled by the Lusignans for decades to come, and as an independent Christian kingdom down to the late 15th century, making its conquest arguably the most tangible result of Richard's entire crusade. The conquest of Cyprus and the subsequent sojourn there during the summer of 1191 also provided the opportunity for Richard to finally wed Berengaria. The wedding ceremony was held at Limassol on the 12th of May 1191 at the chapel of St. George there. The marriage was designed to potentially unite Navarre and the Duchy of Aquitaine, and thus make it part of the wider Angevin Empire in the long run, but this plan would prove elusive. Richard and Berengaria never had any children, they would remain distant from one another, and it has even been questioned whether the marriage was consummated at all. Nevertheless, the union was celebrated with great fanfare and ceremony throughout Cyprus in the early summer of 1191. Overall, these events would foretell great success for Richard when he finally reached the Holy Land. A great kingdom had already been won for the Crusaders, and the new leader arrived as a successful warrior, newly married. The reality, though, would prove more complex. Richard finally landed near the city of Acre on the 8th of June 1191, over a year after he and King Philip had first left France on the Crusade. The Crusader states had been sieging Acre, one of the key cities of the Holy Land in what today is northern Israel, since 1189. This siege was the first major counterattack undertaken by the Crusaders since their defeat by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the fall of Jerusalem. The siege was largely driven in its early stages by Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and his primary rival for power amongst the Crusader noble households, Conrad de Montferrat. They had been joined in April by the King of France. Now, with Richard's additional strength added to their efforts, the siege finally proved too much to withstand for the Arab holders. On the 4th of July, the defenders surrendered. Terms were negotiated in the days that followed, which allowed much of the Arab garrison to leave unharmed in return for a substantial bounty and the provision of prisoners as sureties for payment of the same. The end of the siege also led quickly to Philip's decision to return to France. He had nearly died of dysentery outside Acre and was willing to return to Western Europe ahead of Richard, where he could make major efforts to undermine Richard, while his rival for power in France remained absent in the Holy Land. Richard was now the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade, but he had yet to meet Saladin openly on the field of battle. This would soon come as Richard continued his efforts to secure the coastline of Palestine, in order to use it to solidify the Crusader position and to use it for a fresh drive to retake Jerusalem. And as he prepared to move towards Jerusalem, a notorious atrocity was committed near Acre in late August. By this time, Saladin had missed the payment of the first installment of the ransom which he had promised for the safe passage of the Arab defenders from Acre weeks earlier. And it was owing to this, and the difficulties of transporting large numbers of prisoners inland towards Jerusalem, that Richard and his fellow Crusader leaders such as Guy de Lusignan and Conrad de Montferrat elected in late August to summarily execute upwards of 3,000 Muslim prisoners before leaving Acre. Richard was evidently heavily involved in this decision, although there is significant debate down to this day as to what extent the action violated the laws of war as practiced in the late 12th century. This done, Richard led his forces south towards Jaffa on the 22nd of August, with his army staying close to the coast where they could be reinforced by the Crusader fleet and its ample resources in the eastern Mediterranean. This latter movement would finally lead to Richard meeting Saladin in the field in the foremost direct engagement between the two leaders of the Third Crusade. The Battle of Arsuf was fought on the 7th of September on the route to Jaffa. For days, Saladin, with a force of some 25,000 men, largely light cavalry, had been harrying Richard's numerically inferior but better equipped and trained force of roughly 10,000 infantry and upwards of 1,500 heavy cavalry. The latter were the foremost fighting forces in the Holy Land during the Crusades, but they lacked the maneuverability of Saladin's light cavalry, a fact exacerbated by Richard's unwillingness to move far from his baggage trains and risk losing their water supplies. When, on the 7th of September, a full-scale battle was finally entered into, Saladin's troops succeeded in breaking the Crusaders' formation early on. However, a counterattack in the afternoon by Richard roused the Christian lines, opening gaps in their infantry lines for the heavy cavalry to strike forward at the much more vulnerable light cavalry. After 3 charges of this kind, the Arab armies were broken and fled into the adjoining hills and forests. Contemporary accounts of the casualties are wildly exaggerated, but it is estimated that as many as 5,000 or 6,000 of Saladin's men were killed for under 1,000 of Richard's. Arsuf was the foremost victory in the field for Richard during the Third Crusade. It opened the route to Jaffa, which the Crusaders reached 3 days later. The walls had been dismantled on Saladin's orders, a decision which effectively surrendered the city to the Christians, but which also ensured that Richard had to spend weeks here until makeshift walls were erected to protect the town for the Crusaders. It was while he was here that Richard began envisaging that the key to securing the Holy Land might lie in striking at Saladin's core dominions in Egypt, and, in particular, by seizing Cairo. And this was a strategy which was eventually widely accepted as being the best available to the Crusaders many years later, during the 13th century. But for now, Richard was overruled by Guy, Conrad, and his fellow Crusaders who wished to strike directly at Jerusalem. Thus, the early winter was spent seizing and garrisoning several castles on the route inland from Jaffa to Jerusalem. Consequently, by the end of 1191, Richard's crusade had succeeded in conquering Cyprus for the Christian cause, as well as retaking the Palestinian coast from Acre to Jaffa, with the route to Jerusalem being prepared for a strike at the Holy City. The latter campaign, though, would never be undertaken by Richard. Early in 1192, Richard's role in the Crusades began to inexorably wind down. On the 20th of January 1192 he reached Ascalon, where plans were initiated to begin refortifying the site as a base from which the Muslim powers' caravans travelling across the Holy Land between Syria and Egypt could be attacked. Yet when disputes broke out here amongst the leading crusaders about how this should be funded, Richard withdrew to Acre. Here, further disputes arose between the Crusader contingents, particularly the merchants representing the major trading powers of Italy, on whose financing and supply much of the Crusader states depended, about how to proceed. Consequently, by the late spring, Richard was increasingly faced with the futility of trying to motivate the disparate leaders and groups involved to act in concord. Moreover, it was while at Acre that he received disconcerting news from Western Europe that fresh unrest had arisen back home in his dominions. His brother John was now openly plotting with the French monarchy, and Richard's continued presence in the Holy Land on the Crusades threatened his position as king of the Angevin Empire back home. It was these combined factors which, in the spring of 1192, led him to take the decision to return home without capturing the ultimate prize of Jerusalem. There remained a number of things which needed to be resolved in the Holy Land before Richard could leave. First and foremost amongst these was the issue of the leadership of the Crusade after the English king left. Would Guy de Lusignan, the acknowledged king of Jerusalem, or Conrad de Montferrat, his would-be challenger, succeed Richard as the head of affairs? In an effort to resolve this, Richard summoned a council, where he attempted to establish Conrad as the next head of the Crusader states. In return, Richard sold Cyprus to Guy for a sum of 60,000 bezants. But no sooner had this arrangement been loosely worked out than Conrad was killed by a pair of assassins in late April. It is unclear to this day who had hired these assassins, with everyone from Richard to Saladin being suspected for varying reasons. What is clear is that this cast affairs into further chaos. Then Saladin's recapture of the town of Jaffa at the end of July, before Richard himself could relieve the siege, sealed his decision to leave the Holy Land. On the 2nd of September, a 3-year truce was agreed between Richard and his mortal foe. Richard would surrender Ascalon, but the entirety of the coast from Jaffa to Acre was back in Christian hands, as well as Cyprus, and Christians were guaranteed free access to Jerusalem. Hence it was that Richard departed the Holy Land on the 9th of October, having failed to achieve ultimate success by capturing Jerusalem, but having achieved a great deal. Richard's return to Europe was not straightforward. By November 1192 he had reached the Greek island of Corfu, and at this point elected to travel back to Western Europe through Germany rather than westwards through Italy. Richard was conscious in all of this that he was passing through the territory of several princedoms which were opposed to him, notably Leopold of Austria. Leopold was a staunch ally of Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, a would-be leader of any future crusades, and he consequently viewed Richard as his enemy. Aware that to pass through Leopold's territory would involve the threat of falling into Henry's hands, Richard hired several galleys at Corfu and headed north, accompanied by a relatively small retinue of his most trusted followers, hoping to avoid detection while pretending to be travelling pilgrims on their way back from the Holy Land. But the subterfuge did not work. Their ships crashed on the Istrian coastline, and while heading for Moravia in Austria, they aroused suspicion. As a result, they were finally apprehended near Vienna while passing through Leopold's country in December 1192. Within days, news had been sent to the Emperor Henry that King Richard of England had been apprehended and was being held by Leopold in the castle of Dürnstein, northwest of Vienna. The emperor had more than one reason to have apprehended Richard, for Henry was also loosely allied with King Philip of France. Accordingly, we find the emperor writing to Philip within days to inform the French king of the good news that he had apprehended the English king. Back in England, John also became aware of this and moved to pay homage to Philip in an effort to bolster his claims to succeed his brother. However, the church authorities, which maintained that all crusaders were protected against attacks or seizure when travelling to or from the Holy Land on crusade, were less impressed, and extensive pressure was now applied on Leopold and Henry to release Richard. Hence it was that weeks of protracted negotiations to see whether Richard would be released by his German captors and on what terms were entered into. Finally, in late February 1193, terms were concluded in Speyer, after Richard successfully defended himself against trumped-up claims of having abandoned the crusade. Nevertheless, Richard still had to pay a ransom of 100,000 marks and promised to supply the emperor with 50 galleys and the service of 200 knights annually, resources which Henry utilized to launch his own crusade in the years that followed. Further negotiations on these terms ensued, such that Richard was unable to depart Germany until early in 1194, well over a year after first leaving the Holy Land. Richard now set off on the last leg of his journey home. Not everything which had occurred during his absence had disadvantaged his position with regards to John. In 1192, King Philip had stirred up a rebellion in the Duchy of Aquitaine, but this event had demonstrated the strength of some of Richard's alliances. On this occasion, his wife Berengaria's brother, Sancho of Navarre, to the south in the Basque region, intervened during Richard's absence to suppress the revolt. Indeed, Sancho went even further and launched a punitive raid against Toulouse to demonstrate that Richard's French possessions were not open targets while he was in the Holy Land or making his way home. And back home in England, many senior officials who had been loyal to Richard before he departed on the crusade remained so, and did their best to thwart John's efforts to undermine his brother. Nevertheless, other developments did not bode well for Richard. In April 1193, King Philip finally inflicted a considerable defeat on Richard's cause when he seized Gisors in Normandy, perhaps because the Castellan, a senior official there, had proved willing to surrender in the belief that John would soon succeed Richard as Duke of Normandy. All of this indicates that there was fresh unrest as Richard arrived back to Western Europe in the early months of 1194. Richard left Germany in February 1194 and reached England on the 13th of March. He passed through the Rhineland on his way, on which journey he renewed some alliances with the princes and lord of Western Germany and the Low Countries around modern-day Belgium. Having landed in England, resistance to his resumption of the crown was strikingly limited, a result perhaps of John himself being overseas in the Duchy of Normandy. Richard first visited the religious shrines of Canterbury and Bury St Edmunds before proceeding to the famous Nottingham Castle to confront the centre of John's supposed rebellion. Fighting did occur before the castle surrendered on the 28th of March. Thereafter, Richard resumed the full regalia of his English kingship and presided over several meetings of the government at Winchester, before departing for France in early May to confront John head-on in Normandy. He left the government of England to Hubert Walter, who had accompanied Richard on crusade and who had been made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1193. Richard would never return to England, an indication of the degree to which he viewed France as the core component of his dominions, much as his ancestors as far back as William the Conqueror had. Where England had seen little resistance to Richard's return as king and had been quickly stabilized, the Crusader King's return would prove far less seamless in France. John had dug himself into Normandy, where he relied on a close alliance with the French king to cement his position. Thus, by the time that Richard arrived in northern France in the early summer of 1194, John and King Philip had flooded the region with French troops holding a number of key strategic sites across Normandy as well as other sites, and the French king proved the more loyal and reliable of Richard's opponents. Conversely, no sooner had the English king landed in Normandy than his brother and would-be rival quickly rushed to beg forgiveness from his brother. This Richard agreed to, claiming John had been ill-advised by his counsellors. For his part, John would remain loyal to Richard for the remainder of his reign thereafter. Thus, within just days of his arrival, the conflict switched from a pseudo-civil war between Richard and John to a more traditional war between the King of England and the King of France. And in this, Richard was quickly aided by his familial allies from Navarre, and by mid-June, Tours in central France had been retaken by Richard. The campaign then moved into the Loire River Valley, and after a swift campaign here, he moved south into Aquitaine. By late July, he had captured Taillebourg and Marcillac, the city of Angoulême, Montignac, and La Chaise, thus largely completing Richard's reconquest of his western French territories 3 months after sailing to France from England. Richard's conquest of his French territories, though, would prove more ephemeral than first appeared. In particular, his hold over Normandy was tenuous, and his efforts to fully re-establish his control over the duchy would dominate much of his subsequent reign. In his drive southwards to restore control of Aquitaine in the summer of 1194, Richard had left several castles in the hands of King Philip. Several of these were major strongholds that had been heavily garrisoned in such a way which would require extensive and costly sieges to remove the French. Accordingly, in the late summer of 1194, a truce was agreed, whereby these sites would be allowed to remain in the French king's hands until the winter of 1195, but there would be no fighting between Richard and Philip's troops. On the surface, this arrangement provided both monarchs with advantages. It gave Philip time to rethink his strategic stance, now that the chances of replacing Richard with John altogether seemed implausible, while for Richard this new arrangement would give him a period of 15 months to cement his newly resumed rule and deal effectively with those who had supported John in his attempt to usurp Richard. The truce of 1194 between Richard and the French king proved short-lived. Within weeks of it being agreed, border tensions and skirmishes were breaking out in places throughout France, while by the summer of 1195, full-scale war had effectively recommenced. Richard's approach to this resumed conflict was to concentrate his forces on seizing control of the Auvergne and Berry towards central France, in the border region between Richard's French territories and those of the French monarchy, an approach which quickly bore fruit. By the early autumn of 1195, Philip had indicated that he would relinquish control of any of Richard's territories which he had seized during the king's absence on Crusade, in return for a marriage alliance between Richard's niece Eleanor and Philip's son and heir Louis. This proposal, though, proved abortive, and as fighting continued to rage, Richard made further conquests, ensuring that Philip had to agree to a treaty in January 1196. Then, under the terms of this Treaty of Louviers, Philip relinquished all of his major gains from Richard's period of absence, except the Vexin in northwestern France and a handful of border castles. This ended the conflict in central France to an extent, but fresh tensions would continue elsewhere in the country in the years ahead. As 1196 progressed, the war between Richard and Philip changed dramatically as Philip built up a new alliance of powers to combat Richard's rapid ascendancy on either side of the English Channel. These included several major lords from the Low Countries, notably the Counts of Flanders, Ponthieu and Boulogne, who were joined in the North Atlantic by the Duchy of Brittany in northwestern France. And this new confederacy was now able to apply extensive pressure on Richard's shipping lines and logistical supplies in the English Channel. In order to offset this threat, Richard needed to divert much of his land forces to an invasion of Brittany in mid-1196. Yet, even this setback was only temporary. Eventually, Richard was able to force Count Baldwin of Flanders to change sides, firstly by launching a massive embargo on trade and the supply of goods, and then by offering a favourable alliance of his own. Thus, Baldwin went from blockading Angevin shipping in the Channel to invading Artois in northeastern France on Richard's behalf and seizing the considerable French town of Douai. Then, in a remarkable course of events, an alliance of German princes petitioned Richard that they would put forward Richard's nephew, Otto, son of Richard's sister Matilda, and her husband Henry of Bavaria and Saxony, as a potential successor for the office of Holy Roman Emperor, an astonishing diplomatic coup for Richard. While 1197 and 1198 had seen these further successes for Richard, he would not be alive long enough to enjoy their fruits. In the autumn of 1198, Richard elected to complete the final reduction of the Vexin, a small county near Paris itself, from Philip, following the expiration of a new truce with the French king. Pressured by the Count of Flanders in the northeast and by Richard in the west, Philip twice came perilously close to being captured in the campaign which followed, including nearly drowning on one occasion. This virtually completed the conquest of the Vexin, bringing Richard back into possession of all the lands he had previously held, before heading to the Holy Land and placing him in the strongest position any English monarch had held with respect to the French monarchy for decades. This conquest also initiated a major building program in the region, notably the Château Gaillard, 95 kilometers northwest of Paris and one of the most impressive medieval castles ever built in northern France. Along with major work to develop the port of Portsmouth, it constitutes one of the only major acts of administration and government which can be associated with Richard's kingship, a reign which was ultimately characterized almost entirely by war, whether in the Holy Land or back in Western Europe. In January 1199, King Richard met with his French counterpart King Philip in a meeting brokered by Pope Innocent III. A 5-year truce was now agreed to, one which would see Richard's dominions entering into an unprecedented period of peace and stability. It is entirely peculiar that it was during this period of harmony that Richard would be killed, while still in his early 40s. On the 26th of March 1199, he was shot by a crossbow bolt while campaigning to put down a small regional revolt by Viscount Aymar V of Limoges. In the days that followed, without the benefits of modern medicine, the wound turned gangrenous, and on the 6th of April he died from the illness. He was subsequently buried at Fontevraud. Richard was succeeded by John, whom Richard named as his successor during his final illness. The would-be usurper's accession would spell the end of the conflict with Philip when, in 1200, the Treaty of La Goulée saw John confirmed in his French territories in return for acknowledging Philip as his liege lord in France itself. However, it would prove a short-lived peace, and in the years that followed, the French crown would begin to reconquer several parts of the Angevin Empire from the English monarchy, the beginning of a long process which ultimately would take until the 1550s to complete. Overseas, Richard's efforts proved just as transiently successful. Further crusades followed in the years and indeed decades to come into the late 13th century. Some of these produced variable levels of success in places other than the Holy Land. For instance, in 1204, a Christian army seized the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and established a Western Roman Catholic Christian state in the Balkans for decades to come. Others attempted to seize Egypt as the strategic key to the Holy Land, much as Richard had envisaged in 1191. The Sixth Crusade in the late 1220s finally succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, Richard's ultimate goal, which he had been unable to achieve. Nevertheless, this was a fleeting success, and within 15 years, the Holy City was back in Muslim hands. Thereafter, the fate of the Crusader states dwindled, despite efforts by major European monarchs to undertake fresh efforts to reclaim the holy places for the Christian cause. With the fall of the city of Tripoli in 1289 and the siege of Acre in 1291, 100 years after Richard had landed there in 1191, the Crusader cause was extinguished in the Holy Land. It was due in some considerable way to Richard's efforts, though, that these Christian kingdoms lasted here for as long as they did. Richard the Lionheart is one of England's most acclaimed kings, a somewhat strange development given the shortness of his reign. He ruled for just 10 years, half of which period was spent far overseas in Sicily, Cyprus, the Holy Land, and Germany. Yet, it is this period which has also gained him his reputation and made him most famous. For 2 years in the Mediterranean world, Richard led the Crusader effort in the wake of years of losses for the Christian states there, as well as successive defeats to Saladin. It is unsurprising that Richard has captured the imagination in this way, not least because he finally offered a counterpoint to the seemingly invincible Muslim warlord. After the stalemate of the Second Crusade, in the middle of the 12th century, Richard was depicted as the first major Crusader leader to have made significant conquests and territorial gains in the Holy Land since the First Crusade over 90 years earlier. For successive generations of chroniclers and historians since the late 12th century itself, this appearance of the valorous Crusader warrior, named the Lionheart for his courage, was made all the starker when contrasted with the supposedly scheming spectre of his brother John, who back in Western Europe conspired with the French to usurp Richard while his brave brother was away. But while this is the idealized version of Richard and the basis for so much of his legacy, there is also much to criticize about the Lionheart. Criticisms which have dominated studies of the king by historians in recent decades. First and foremost, his reign was dominated by warfare. This had started long before his own accession, with the conflicts with his father in the 1170s and 1180s. It continued through his involvement in the Crusades and eased after returning from the Holy Land. While much of the latter conflict can certainly be blamed on others for having usurped some of his territory while he was absent in the East, the reality is that Richard could have negotiated a peace settlement with King Philip long before 1199 if he had been willing to compromise slightly on how many castles
This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, the amazing documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers that includes subjects such as ancient and modern history, science, the earth and nature, true crime, as well as historical drama. We love the series The Warrior's Way, the original superheroes, and especially the episode Knights to Templars, Geoffroy de Champagne. The superb documentary covers the Knights Templars, God's warriors forged out of the Crusades. Knight Geoffroy de Champagne foregoes earthly pleasures to join the Templars and proudly wears the white mantle with a red cross. The Knights Templars' greatest patron was Richard the Lionheart, England's great Crusader King. With Magellan TV, there are no advertisements and you can watch content anytime, anywhere, on your TV, laptop or mobile phone. And with 15 to 20 hours of new content being added on a weekly basis, you will always have something to watch. And with an annual membership costing only $59.88, you pay only $4.99 per month for over 3,500 hours of viewing time. Viewers can take advantage of a special holiday offer. Buy one, get one free gift card for an annual membership by clicking on the link in the description.
Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.